Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, doing another quickie review here of the new Snoop Dogg album, Neva Left. I've been getting tons of requests to react to talk about this new Snoop Dogg record, and I don't know, I'm not really that into it, to be completely honest, if we're just being completely honest here. And I feel like that's partially because the title, the cover conveys, and even the intro track conveys and tells you one thing, but I feel like the album actually does another. You know, what Snoop Dogg and what this album would love you to sort of come away from this record with, would love you to think going into this album, is that, hey man, I had my heyday back in the 90s, that's when all my classic shit came out, and honestly, nothing's changed. Still the same guy. I could still come through with the same sound, and it'll be excellent. It'll be amazing. Nothing's changed. Still the same rapper, still the same artist, and here's the proof. Here's the proof of that. When in reality, it's very obvious that everything has changed. Everything is very different. Things are not the same, and we're just trying to recapture some nostalgia here in a really ineffective way, which is disappointing because I would think that, if any artist from that era of hip hop on the West Coast working today would be able to kind of recapture that magic, recapture that sound, it would be Snoop Dogg. And yet I think he falls so short of doing that. Partially because some of the tracks that do have an old school G-Funk vibe are kind of awkward, but also because I feel like part of the way into the record, he just kind of gives up entirely on trying to keep true to that sound and is just like, okay, let me do a trap track. Okay, let me do another song that veers off in a completely other direction that doesn't have anything to do with, the origins of this sound that I'm trying to recapture here. And, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that this album came out as inconsistent as it did, because Snoop Dogg's last record, he tried to do a little bit of a throwback thing. Maybe he wasn't being quite as obvious with the concept of doing so. But certainly, just from the sound of some of the tracks on that record and from the look of the title on that record, he was clearly trying to, recall the Doggy Style days to a degree, at least. On this new record over here, it seems like bringing things back and bringing back that nostalgia. It seems like that was the name of the game, but Snoop Dogg couldn't stick to his own concept. He couldn't stick to his own theme on this album. You're telling everybody that everything's the same, never changed, you never left, when in fact there are tons of tracks on this record where you totally abandon the sound that you're trying to, kind of rekindle a passion for. And honestly, like a lot of those tracks where he veers off in another direction are kind of lackluster. They're kind of mediocre. They're not the highlights of the record. So again, I love Snoop Dogg's old sound. There are at least a handful of tracks on here where I think he effectively recaptures that and does a great job. But it's just kind of sad not only to see him sort of fall short of my expectations for him sort of bringing G-Funk back a little bit, but also to see him falling behind the ball on sort of the resurgence of his own sound, because there are newer artists who have kind of brought back kind of this West Coast sound. And they're obviously super young. They maybe grew up with the sound, but they didn't grow up in the sound. They didn't grow up in its heyday, or at least when they were super, super young. They're coming of age now, and they're toying with a sound that their forefathers had sort of, brought to the forefront. And now I feel like Snoop Dogg is sort of late to his own kind of nostalgia party here, and with an album that isn't even fully an embrace of the idea that he's putting forward with the cover, the title, the intro, and numerous tracks on here. It only takes about 5 or 6 tracks into the track listing for him to almost completely abandon this idea and then just like start delivering yet another inconsistent album. But those are kind of my thoughts on it. Also, that intro track, I mean, honestly, it's cool that he wanted to do what he wanted to do with the instrumental, but you cannot hear that instrumental and not think of Cream. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, you just can't. It's just too disruptive. And it's not that, he's not enough of a god to sort of approach it like that, but it would just be disruptive for any artist to do it. It doesn't matter who you are. But I digress. That was not really a part of the a part of my issues on the issue with the overall album. If you're a hardcore Snoop Dogg fan, um, and honestly, you don't even really need to be a hardcore fan. But if you are a hardcore fan, you're going to love the shit out of this record. If you're a casual fan, there are a lot of things to like about this album. Chances are you're going to like more tracks on this album than dislike, to be completely honest. Because even if Snoop Dogg doesn't keep consistently on the theme and the idea of Neva Left and, the idea of sort of recapturing this nostalgia, this is one of his most consistent albums in years. But, my problem is that it's not nearly as consistent as it could have been, especially considering what seems to be, the bold and straightforward communication that this is me bringing it back. This is me truly going back to my old sound, and it's like nothing's ever changed. And if that's really the message you're trying to communicate here, you've fallen horribly short. I think the record that he did with Dame Funk not too long ago, that the handful of songs off of that album, was a more consistent embrace of an old school sound. This again is just kind of all over the place. Definitely more consistent than a lot of his material over this decade and even last decade. But it's just not where I think it could have been. And that for me is a letdown, because Snoop Dogg is a great, and I would love for him to, come out with another classic, get another classic under his belt. And I feel like Neva Left is just, unfortunately, like not really there.